In early 2016, I wrote a review of Robert Eggers' debut film, The Witch, that, for one reason or another, never actually made its way onto the internet. It was largely glowing, focused primarily on how disconcertingly realistic its depiction of 1600s New England felt, and taking great pains to discuss one of the strangest thoughts I've ever had while watching a film. You see, one of the child actors was hamming it the heck up, and I just rolled my eyes at it before thinking, well, I guess they had trouble casting back then. Which was immediately followed by literally thousands of mental exclamation points when I realized that I had momentarily convinced myself that this film wasn't just set 400 years ago, it was shot then. That the team had developed time travel and used it to shoot a narrative film. I don't know what the logic was. Brains are weird. But I can also say that I have seen a lot of period pieces, and that is not a thought I'd ever had before or since. This film had achieved a level of realism in production that the flaws in its performances had to be explained away by a literal impossibility. I just couldn't reconcile it. And in that, Eggers proved his ability to create another era that truly feels right. So I've been excited by when he would turn his time machine to next. As it turns out, the 1890s. Hello, by the way, and welcome to the Week Air Review. You can call me still embarrassed by that thought. And today, I'm talking about The Lighthouse. The Lighthouse is a very simple movie, and its entire plot can be summarized in a sentence. Two people put into a confined space for an extended period of time are slowly driven mad. It is exactly what you think. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that. It's about the journey. And golly, what a journey The Lighthouse is. From a production standpoint, this is the anti-Witch. That film, shot on an Arri Alexa with mostly natural light, is crisp and clean. It relies on painstaking research and recreation to transport the audience to its new world. The Lighthouse, on the other hand, looks as grimy as its waterlogged location. Despite Eggers' statements to the contrary, it feels designed to be a film from a century ago, albeit with all of the lessons learned in the years since, and some of the technological enhancements too. The Panaflex Millennium XL2 they shot on is the kind of thing that folks a century plus ago couldn't have comprehended. But it's been combined with lenses from the 1930s and even one from 1912. The black and white 35mm film that they were using didn't look quite old enough, so they added a customized filter that cut red light, largely replicating the effect of orthochromatic film stock from before the 1930s. Combine all of that with the absolutely bizarre 1.19 to 1 aspect ratio, and you get a movie that feels like nothing else. It's actually like the nostalgic version of old films rather than their reality, what you think they look like if you haven't seen one in a while. Actually, I first thought it may even be a silent film, or at least close to one, since nobody says anything until around minute 5. There's just the sound of the rock on which Ephraim Winslow, played by Robert Pattinson, and Thomas Wake, a hobbled Willem Dafoe, will be spending the next month, as well as this sound that we'll be hearing about 13,000 times over the ensuing hour 50. Wake is the master here, and he forces Pattinson to do everything except the one thing he wants to do, sit with the lantern. That is Wake's responsibility, seemingly his only one, other than cooking. Eventually, words begin to flow like the increasingly destructive alcohol the pair consumes, and they take their toll, physically and psychologically. To quote Eggers, nothing good happens when two men are alone in a giant phallus. And we see this proverbial dick-measuring contest through the eyes of Winslow, as Pattinson trains for his role as Batman by doing heavy labor while keeping his eye on that big, shiny prize at the top. Only in a couple of brief moments do we see Wake's world, and honestly, it's not even entirely clear what is going on in his days. This singular perspective becomes critical in the back half of the film as things go completely off the rails. By committing to a subjective camera, Eggers puts us off kilter. And by putting that subjective camera with Winslow, who starts things off seeming pretty stable but grows increasingly unhinged as time goes on, we are unable to determine what is real and what isn't. We can guess, particularly with things that are intercut between what seems to be real and then a fantasy. But other times, our experience alongside Winslow is contradicted by Wake's words, and we have to decide if we think it's because Wake is lying to him or because Winslow has lost his mind. Pattinson sells this decline beautifully. Honestly, he has become one of the most interesting actors working today. Both he and Twilight star Kristen Stewart have largely turned towards smaller, stranger projects. And I'm glad for that, because they've long since proven that they were so much better than the material that made them famous. This year in particular has been fascinating for Pattinson, pairing The Lighthouse with Claire Denis' High Life, which is a particularly unsettling vision of space travel that one of my coworkers walked out of almost immediately. Pattinson's recent characters have all been broken, but in very different ways, and it makes me really curious about his take on Bruce Wayne. Willem Dafoe is so committed to Thomas Wake that it sometimes feels a bit like parody. I had seriously considered attempting his seafaring accent for at least the introduction to this video, but I just can't replicate it. As with The Witch, Eggers and his co-writer/brother Max turned to primary sources in an attempt to build the language of the characters. But where The Witch was primarily written with words from that time, The Lighthouse used them more as a jumping-off point. But it was in keeping with how an oft-isolated drunk like Wake would have talked, which is just kind of ridiculous. Dafoe's gruff delivery did get some, shall we say, inappropriate laughter from the crowd on a couple of occasions. I think I laughed precisely once in general, and it was at a moment that's in the trailer but whose tone was radically recontextualized for marketing purposes. This isn't a funny movie, but certainly some folks had a bit of a giggle. Though I think that partly gets at something interesting, which is how The Lighthouse actively evades genre classification. I think we can reasonably call it horror, albeit a more art house type of horror that will put off more than a few people. But to really drill down requires a determination on your part about what you actually believe is going on. The big question is this supernatural? There are reasons to believe that it is. Though Winslow says the curse is a tall tale, his killing of a gull immediately brings about a change in the wind that heralds treacherous weather. Given that Eggers' first film was about witches and Satan and etc., it's clear that he's got no qualms with working in that realm, so there's no reason to think that The Lighthouse wouldn't be. But the moments of gull-related unreality are the only ones that I feel comfortable saying definitively happened. And I don't know if those are quite enough to make the call. Or I wouldn't if it weren't for the mythology of it all. Though Wake invokes the name of Neptune rather than Poseidon, the film seems to have more direct connections to Greek mythology than it does to Roman. Take the recurring image of a mermaid. Wikipedia tells me that the mermaid is probably a reference to Greek sirens, which were originally conceived as part bird, but became part fish during the rise of Christianity. By itself, this wouldn't mean much, since mermaids of some sort are found in stories all over the world. But there are a couple of moments that are Greek as hell, including one clearly Sisyphean task, and then a shot that, even if you think you don't know any Greek mythology, you will know is from Greek mythology, and is also reminiscent of one of the more disturbing scenes from The Witch. Eggers says that shot is also one of the few not from Winslow's perspective, but his own, meaning it is one of the only moments in the movie you know you can trust. and that makes it all the more confusing. But certainly it's something that's going to stick with me for a while. Maybe haunt my dreams. I don't know. Guess we'll have to see on that one. During the movie, I kept trying to think about how I wanted to frame this review, and particularly what I might want to call it. And one thing that I ultimately scrapped but had seriously considered was, The Lighthouse is the kind of movie I hate, parentheses, but I liked it. And I scrapped it not because I didn't like the movie, because I definitely did, but because I don't think the underlying statement is true anymore. The Lighthouse is not actually the kind of movie I hate. It's the kind of movie I hated. When I think about what it is I didn't like in movies years ago that either didn't bother me here or I even found outright compelling, it speaks more to my own developing taste. I've never needed movies to be straightforward, but historically I've found overtly obtuse storytelling frustrating in a way that I just don't now. And that's good, because as I've said, The Lighthouse defies any kind of definitive interpretation. Though the Eggerses know the answers to everything, which means there are answers, which I appreciate, they don't want the viewers to come away from it sure of anything. And now, I think that's fun, to be honest. There's a lot to unpack, and I expect the discourse around The Lighthouse to be a lot more pleasant than some of the other films that have been released recently. And also just generally more interesting. It is a film that invites multiple interpretations and all but demands multiple viewings, one perfect for sitting around and talking about endlessly, until everyone is driven mad. 8.1 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you particularly to my patrons, my mom, Hamry and Marco, Kat Saracata, Benjamin Schiff, Anthony Cole, and @BlasianFMA. If you liked this video, that's great. If you didn't, I'm sorry. If you want to see more, please subscribe. I hope to see you next week.